Welcome to Storycomic Presents, where we interview amazing storytellers and artists. This is episode 369. I am your host, Barney Smith of Storycomic.com, and we're honored to have with us the internationally revered dark fantasy independent comic book publisher, Wes Al-Dhaher. Wes.
Thanks for having me, Barney.
You have quite a successful story that you're doing now. Now, Tales of Khayr? Is that how you pronounce it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. Talk to us a little bit about this. This is all part of the Brotherhood of the Wolf series, correct?
Yeah. So the flagship series is the Brotherhood of the Wolf, and really it's there because I wanted to. There was a few problems I wanted to solve. I initially, I'm a huge fan of the fantasy genre,
right?
But one of the things I noticed is just some patterns, and talking to other people, like these patterns kind of were borne out. So one of the first things, like you might remember the first time you picked up a fantasy book, you're pulled into it, it's exciting, etc. You're hooked, and so then you pick up another, and then another, and then another, and it's exciting because like wow, anything can happen. Fantasy's great, etc., etc. Orcs, goblins, wizards, etc. But then you start noticing patterns, like certain little tropes that jump out at you every book after book, where it's like, oh, here's yet another female character who's an orphan who falls in love with never do well, or it's like, oh, here's another thing where the hero hates somebody, but then after a little bit they become friends after a few like chapters or scenes or whatever, and it's like, okay, it gets a person wondering, like, when am I gonna read something original, right? when because we're past the point where, like, I think, and you might remember this, Barney, I don't know how big of a fantasy fan you are, but like up until like the late 90s, early 2000s, between Tolkien to then, the fantasy genre was mainly just like a copy pasta of J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, where what the world that Tolkien created, kind of like in the distance of time, kind of like a medieval fantasy world that's supposed to be kind of set in northwestern Europe, kind of sorta, and then the ethereal, the kind of voice that he has in narrating it, like, which is kind of very authoritative and distant. Like everybody was doing that. So like essentially what people tried to do to make a quick buck in the publishing world was just to do like in a few weeks what Tolkien did in his entire lifetime, and try to replicate that. And that was the state of fantasy for a while. But then fast forward, you get folks like George R.R. Martin, who created the Song of Ice and Fire series, like, which was made into the TV show Game of Thrones. And it's like, okay, that introduced a whole level of grittiness, more character focus, more complicated, more brutal. And so that's great. But then everybody started trying to copy pasta George R.R. Martin. and you're back to these tropes. So it's like, okay, can somebody please do something original now? And then there's the issue of like just like the implausible aspects of so many of these like fantasy stories, especially when it comes to the protagonist. Like, I don't know if you've noticed this, but like the protagonist, who doesn't know anything in the beginning, like all of a sudden learns a magic system in the course of like a week that took all his predecessors like years to learn. And it's like, oh, okay, because the plot demanded it, I suppose. Or like, you have somebody who's growing up as a barefoot urchin in the middle of a filthy city, and they just never happen to get a foot infection. So like just stuff like that. It's just like, okay, well, it'd really be nice if there was some like characters that you could kind of believe in, that like even if they have some fantastic powers going on, that they're real people with real challenges or real flaws that they have to overcome. Because if you're being asked to invest in like a thick tome of story, you'd like to be invested in the characters. Another thing is like just a lot of these fantasy stories, they're just a bit too sprawling, a bit too big. Like every story has to be this multi-installment series, which is fine, but it, it, a lot of time, most of the time, it's created in a way where it's a blocker to new people, where it's like, hey, listen,
Mhm.
my name, I'm Joe Schmo, who just wants to pick up something fun, interesting, something that he could escape into, without having to read like 1,000 other works to understand what he's reading now. And so those are kind of the big problems that I saw in the fantasy genre. Plus the fact that there there wasn't really anything in the setting, as far as like a lot of the times like the settings are either in like fantasy northwestern Europe, like England and stuff like that, or Viking land. And then lately people are doing like Renaissance Italy and stuff like that, but nothing really like in the Orient. Like when I say Orient, I mean like I'm using it archaically, like the Middle East
Mhm.
or the Islamic world, etc. Except as secondary characters who are like kind of brown. They may be wearing turbans. They have like crooked swords, and like ooh, they add some spice into the casserole of the story that you're creating. And I was like, okay, well, let's see if I can introduce something new here, like to solve all these problems all at once. And that is how the Brotherhood of the Wolf was born, which is a dark fantasy series set in the 15th century Ottoman Ottoman Empire. And so it's kind of got that level of character-driven work that people, character-driven story that people like, complicated plots or complex plots, and just monsters that you haven't really seen before. Like even with
Mm.
vampires, we play with that a little bit, as far as the
Right.
concept is concerned.
So what are some of the tropes that you completely just destroyed out the gate, and which ones have you kind of nodded to say, I tweaked this a little bit?
Yeah, so one of the tropes out of the gate is uh, like the so there's this trope of like there's two tropes I demolish at the same time with one character. I won't spoil it too much, but essentially, like in the past, like the knight in shining armor was always the good guy. Like he was a good looking guy, long blonde hair flowing in the wind, polished armor, usually a prince, uh, but still tough as nails and pure hearted. And he just wants to do the right thing. Gosh darn it! And then after a while, like the fantasy genre grew a little bit, where they kind of tried to flip that on its head and say, "Oh, okay, well, outwardly he might be like this, but inwardly he's like this psychopath who likes to torture innocent bunnies, etc., etc." So one of the things that I kind of play with is like we take somebody like that, and he is like that, but he actually generally he's not a psychopath. He generally is. He thinks he's doing the right thing. He's very glory hungry, um, and he thinks that him doing something unethical, like breaking a treaty essentially that he wrote, that he signed,
Right.
because like a case was made to him by one of the villains, like, hey, you should do this because it's better for your people, better for the realm. You're protecting them, but also at the same time, like it'll make him look like a hero. And
Right.
so with that motivation, he goes in and tries to do his thing. And I do something to him that might be surprising to some folks. So that kind of trope I play with.
Right.
The thing that you won't see too much of is like the um, the 90-pound voluptuous woman who is able to kick the collective butts of 220-pound muscle bound killers. Like we see that a
Yeah.
lot, like the girl boss type of a trope.
Right.
And this isn't to say like, and just to be clear, this isn't like one of those things that's like, oh, woke media, and we want to create something that pushes back against woke media. Like you see a lot of people like defining their series by being anti woke.
Yeah.
I Brotherhood of the Wolf isn't anti woke. It's just not that. It's just not woke.
Right.
And so it's like, look, okay, we're trying to deal with real people. Yes, it's a fantasy. There's interesting stuff going on, but like real people, would a 90-pound voluptuous 20-year-old lady be able to kick the butts of 220-pound muscle-bound guys in armor? Just probably not, right? But we're able to create female characters who are like strong in terms of their personality, and they're able to kick butt physically, but they have to be like cunning about it, right?
Right.
It can't just be like going into a group of guys just like doing kung fu in high heels, and
Right.
she wins the day. And a lot of times, it doesn't turn out the way that they think it does.
Right.
So those things, it's like, okay, we want to tell an interesting, compelling dark fantasy story, which has a lot of horror elements, but we want like people who feel real. And so that's kind of the tack that we go about it.
Well, hey there. If you're enjoying our podcast, don't forget to subscribe on YouTube or leave us a 5-star review on your favorite podcast platform. Your support means the world to us and helps us keep this show going. We love hearing from you, so any feedback is welcome. And thank you for being a part of our podcast family and for all your support. It truly means a lot to us. What made you decide to make this into, say, into a comic book medium instead of saying a long form dark fantasy novel?
Well, that's a great question, Barney, and I'm glad you asked us. And by the way, that really is a good question, because we did not prep these questions, and so this is a really good question. I actually initially wanted to write them as novels, but for me, it's just like there's art, there's wanting to express oneself, which I think you might appreciate. But then there's also the issue of like, you also have customers, and you want to do the right by your customers and have your customer be happy. And I'm like, okay, for the target audience that I'm trying to reach, millennial, Gen Z, people who do like dark fantasy, I just started talking to people. I'm like, hey, so, because I'm a big reader, I read a lot of prose, but I have a lot of narcissism. But when it comes to creating products that people like, I try to like put my narcissism to the side and just and talk to people and observe them. And one of the things is like, hey, so what books do you like to read, et cetera, et cetera. Like, it's like, a lot of the answers I'd get were like, it's been a while since I read a book. Maybe the Giver when I was in middle school. I'm like, oh my God. It's like, what do you do now? Like, what do you do for entertainment? And they're like, well, watch Netflix, read anime, watch movies, a lot of stuff on my phone, stuff like that. And I'm like, oh, like, okay, well, so clearly I need to make these, if people are going to enjoy these stories, it has to be in a visual media. And there's different types of visual media. You have movies, TV shows, but that requires a lot of capital that I just don't have. I'm like, okay, well, I've always been a fan of manga and comic books. Why not just have it be like a comic book?
Right.
But in order to do that, like, I know each media has its own strengths and weaknesses, and I didn't want to do this thing where it's like a lot of indie comic book creators, they have this thing called like the maybe movie model, where it's like, hey, we're going to create comic books. We're not really going to give too much effort into the craft of what it takes to create a compelling comic book. We're just going to treat these comic books like storyboards, kind of like R&D, so that hopefully maybe Netflix will look at it and pick it up as a TV show. And like, A, that's a horrible business model, but B, like, you're not doing right by your customers. You're not giving the medium the respect that it deserves. So I'm like, okay, let me really do this right. So that's one of the reasons why I gathered a team around me who were like industry pros, worked at Disney, Marvel, IDW, etc. Like guys who knew what it took to create visually a great comic book. And so that's how we proceeded.
Right. And so what issue are you at now then for Brotherhood of the Wolf?
Brotherhood of the Wolf issue number 1 is done. It's like,
right.
It's ready to go. And it's 32 pages. So each issue kind of will run pretty long. It's like 28 to 32 pages. And because they're so long, pretty long form for a standard comic book, I'm like, you know what? Let me create for the audience, before just dumping a gem like chapter number 1 on their laps. Let me give them something a little bit smaller, to kind of like an appetizer, right? You wouldn't just jump into the steak. You'd have like, I don't know, some shrimp or whatever. So I'm like, okay, so let me create like a short story, and introduce that to people first. And I kind of got crazy and ambitious, and I'm like, hey, listen, guys, I wrote this short story, so it's going to be a short story. It's going to be like, let's see if we can have it be 1 page. And then I realized, wait a minute, the way I wrote this, it's no way it's going to be 1 page. I'm like, okay, 6 pages. 6 pages, and we'll make it like, just to show off our storytelling muscles, we're going to have it be wordless, silent, no dialogue, completely silent experience, and grayscale. Let's do grayscale because I love that. Like, the main series is colored, obviously, as what you're showing, but let's have it be grayscale because that's cool. Gives us that
Yeah.
manga taste. And they're like, okay, uh, but that means we have to start drawing on paper. And these are just like pencils from what you're showing right now, are pencils from Brotherhood of the Wolf issue number 1, which do have colors.
Mm-hmm.
The short story is called The Lesser Evil, where angels die, monsters rise. And so the lesser evil, first it was like I said, 1 page, then 6 page. I'm like, okay, 8 pages to really give it justice. And then as my artist is drawing it and etc., I'm like, you know what, 12 pages. And so now it's like a 12. As of right now, it's going to be a 12-page, nonetheless short story, silent, grayscale comic book that kind of gives us the origin story of Koja, the guy in the mask who we were showing off there. And so that's where it starts. Yeah, very violent. Brotherhood of the Wolf, ladies and gentlemen, is a very violent comic book. If you don't like blood and guts, it is not for you.
So yeah, what's the age group for this?
I don't have a strict age group. It's really just more like you as a reader, what's your comfort level, or you as a parent, what's your
Right.
acceptability level. I would just say, like, for me, it's just a strict thing of like not showing anything related to sex,
Right.
Because that's not the kind of publishing house that I'm running. But dark fantasy, it's dark. so
Right.
a lot of blood and gore. And so if you're comfortable with that and horror elements, you'd like it. But if any of those things, blood, gore, violence, scary situations, don't resonate, then it's probably not for you.
Right.
Yeah.
So being dark fantasy, is it like what defines it as a fantasy, as in that genre, instead of say like a historical piece?
Yeah, so historical piece is just a setting, and a fantasy is really about, roughly speaking, it's really about um, a protagonist who a lot of times is kind of suppressed in some way, going into an imaginative world that doesn't really
Mm-hmm.
exist in real life, and going through a journey there, and a lot of times coming back to the mundane world. And so you'll
Right.
see that kind of pattern with Harry Potter, like
Yeah.
he's living with these Muggles, and then he goes to Hogwarts, and or uh, the Wizard of Oz, where she's like in Kansas, and in the movie they deliberately make everything gray in the beginning until she goes to the land of Oz and everything is bright and magical, etc. So that's really what
Yeah.
fantasy is as a genre. Um, People associate genres with certain tropes, and that's not necessarily the thing, right?
Right.
So that's as far as fantasy. And you could set fantasies in different settings. You could set it in a medieval setting. You can set it in a urban setting, like that they call that like urban fantasy.
Right.
So setting isn't as important as just the as what I described earlier. And so yeah, it's a dark fantasy set in the 15th century Ottoman Empire, and the reason I said in the 15th century is like it's that period of time is like an interesting transitionary period where it's like you got the late medieval time period where there's still knights and horses and swords and that sort of thing, but now you start getting gunpowder and rifles and cannons, and so you got that nice merging between the two. That's also at around the same time that like huge like the fall of Constantinople. I you
Mm-hmm.
know Also at around the same time, incidentally, that Dracula was around. Might be doing something with that. So that's as far as that setting. But what makes it dark, what makes fantasy dark, is if you throw in horror elements.
Mm.
And so that's what we have. So that's what makes it dark fantasy, is like a fantasy story with secondary horror elements baked in on top.
Are you actually throwing in some of the expected tropes of that, like throwing in like gins and things like that as well?
Yeah. So
Yeah.
you'll see jinns, but in a way that you haven't seen them before. Like, jinns in this story, they're not nice; they're scary.
Yeah.
Because, like, like people think a jinn. Well, a jinn's really a demon.
Yeah.
So, but like, I think just because of the whole Arabian Nights thing, where it's like, okay, he goes in and you rub the thing and gives you wishes, and a lot of times, like, you'll kind of understand that jinn aren't really good because the wishes that they give you won't be what you asked for, really.
Right.
But really, it's just like, no, like the jinn here is like very much like demonic, occult, scary, not something you want to mess
Yeah.
around. And when people do mess around with it, it's a source of regret, pain, and adventures.
And what else in, like, say, like the in the Middle Eastern, like, mythos, is there, because jinn is the first and foremost thing that people think of because of
Yeah.
the Arabian Nights. Is there other mystical and mythical creatures that we could expect?
Well, here's the thing. So it's not like, so even though I'm setting it like in the Ottoman Empire, I'm trying to have a little bit more creativity and then saying like, okay, well, since it's in the Ottoman Empire and they're kind of wearing harem pants and sandals and got the
Right.
crooked swords going, I'll just throw in just your standard tropes from of creatures from that region. Instead, what I do is like I kind of twist things and play with things,
Okay.
and sometimes like I introduce monsters that don't really have anything to do with um, anything specifically Middle Eastern, but it makes sense to what the characters would do, and and what the resources they have available. So like there's this concept of ghoul, like in Middle Eastern folklore, where it's like a person who likes to cannibalize people.
Right.
So and so I play with that a lot, but one of the things I really tried hard to do is like the monsters that you see in the Brotherhood of the Wolf are something you haven't really seen before. You won't look at that and be like, oh, that's a ghoul. You'd be like, what the f is that? That's terrifying. And so you'll start seeing something very, yeah, I'll name it. I'll name it because I won't show it, but I'll name it because the name itself won't spoil too much. But in issue number 2 of the Brotherhood of the Wolf, there is a very scary monster called the Zacchaeus Butcher,
Okay.
and it's essentially at a very high level. So I won't get too spoilery. It's a demonic automaton.
Okay.
So stuff like that, where it's like, yeah, no, we're not. There's no like flying carpets here, if that's what people are expecting. Something
Right.
a little bit
Yeah.
more unique, a little bit more intense, is what we're
Right.
introducing. Yeah,
As you're describing it, this is a world adjacent. This isn't our world then, even though it's taking place in the
yeah. You could
Ottoman
consider it like kind of
Empire.
like an alternate history of our world, right?
Right.
Because last time
Yeah.
I checked, there was no Zacchaeus Butcher um,
Yeah.
in the history books, but yeah, like kind of alternate history, our world. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, so talk to us. I'm really curious. The Brotherhood of the Wolf, is this a limited series? Could you talk about this? You have a publishing house. How does this fit within, Tales of
Yeah,
Khayr?
so Tales of Khayr is the publishing house, and one of the things I try to do is uh, it's direct to consumer, and I only sell
Okay.
floppies, so they
Okay.
won't like physical copies. So you won't, like, you might get digital assets like a screensaver, etc.
Right.
But and that'll be, we're going to update the website to be more specific about what's on offer. But really, like, as far as the comic books themselves, they're always going to be physical. That's my promise to the
Okay.
fans out there. And so, print it out and ship it directly to your house. That's the idea. And obviously, each issue is going to be limited because it's not like there's always going to be inventory of each issue. So a certain issue will have its run, and then we'll stop printing those and then move on to the next one. And the
Okay.
only time you'll have access to the content in issue number 1 is if there's ever like a trade paperback edition or like an omnibus edition. Yeah.
Right. And so, what's your process of how many issues are you expecting of, say, Brotherhood of the Wolf? What's the run for that one?
Well, yeah, it's not so much like, it'll be more like a print on demand thing where it's like, okay, from this time period to this time period, this is when we're going to be, printing these out and fulfilling on them. But after like a
Right.
certain date, we're going to stop and we're going to move on to the next issue. Yeah.
Yeah. So how many issues is this going to be? Is Brotherhood of the
How
Wolf
many
going to be an
issues? Yeah.
ongoing series?
Yeah. It's going to be a long-term series. It's like I have a clear idea of when of how it'll end.
Right.
But it's just going to take a while to get to there. So you can consider this like a long-term series, kind of like in the spirit of manga, where it's
Right.
like you have a linear story, but eventually it'll have a clear conclusion. As opposed
Right.
to a lot what you see in American comics, where it's like, where do I start? Where do I start my Batman story, Barney? Like, I have no idea.
Yeah.
It's like there's multiple, you know. So no, we're following the manga model, where it's just going to be like telling the story more or less sequentially until it gets to its final narrative conclusion. Yeah.
And are you thinking about because you have a publishing house that's separate of the name of Brotherhood of the Wolf? Are you have other titles that you're planning on as well?
I do. I have this general vague ideas about them. You know, there's stuff because Brotherhood of the Wolf. It's you know it's directed towards folks who love fantasy, particularly dark fantasy and horror. And but I know that like not everybody likes that genre, or it's not everyone's cup of tea. So I'm thinking like doing something for women who might not necessarily like dark fantasy, but like something else, or even doing something for kids that's kid friendly.
Hmm.
But as of right now, no, our focus is Brotherhood of the Wolf because this thing is a whopper of a series that requires a lot of love and attention. Yeah.
Well, then how long does it take for an issue to come out then?
You know, my goal is to aim for quarterly, considering that each issue
Okay.
is like around between 28 to 32 interior story pages. Like at least
Right.
quarterly, we might get faster than that.
Right.
But that's kind of what I'm aiming for at this point. Yeah.
Okay. That's not a bad turnaround then. Because then if you think about it, then in 3 years you'll come out with 12 issues.
Yeah. And here's the thing: I made a deliberate choice not to do crowdfunding.
Yeah.
So essentially, because like one of the things I notice is like there's a lot of great crowdfunding campaigns there, and people give the customers what they've been promised. But I see a
Yeah.
lot of crowdfunding out there where it's like, hey, we have this great idea, give me money. They get the money, and then either they don't deliver,
Right.
or it takes them like forever to deliver, and that
Right.
just leads to customers with a bad taste in their mouth. So I'm like, you know what? No, I'll do the self-funded, out of my own pocket, create these, and then once it's ready, I just sell it. So like
Right.
not crowdfunding, you're not supporting, you're buying your physical copy of the book, and it gets to you in a timely manner. Like just
Yeah.
simple as that.
Excellent.
Yeah.
And so what? And so as you say, Wes, is issue number one available now
I have it ready
as
now.
of
It's
this
all done.
recording?
It's all done, but
Okay.
I'd like to sell the Lesser Evil short story first, just
Okay.
because it's it's shorter. So I want
Right.
to give people a taste of what we're about, than giving them a whopper like issue number one,
Right.
which is like 32 interior story pages.
Right.
So and the Lesser Evil will be ready hopefully like in this summer. So like near the end of summer, we should have it ready
Right.
to go out and ship.
And so for those that might be listening to this episode a year from now, um, and they're like, "Wow, this sounds like an amazing comic. Where can I pick it up? Where would a listener or viewer purchase your series?"
Yeah, I think the thing to do is to just tail the website talesofkhayr.com, and
Hmm.
just sign in to your just put in your email address, and you'll get notified when any of the products are ready. And you know, I've tried to be respectful with people who are on my email list, so I don't email too often. And when I do,
Right.
it's stuff that's educational and entertaining, while also
Right.
saying, hey, here's your chance to get this book. Here's your chance to get that book. So yeah, go to the website and sign up to the email list. That's really the way.
All right. And then I say Tales of Khayr. It's
Yeah.
KHAYR.com. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Perfect. And we'll have that in the show notes as well.
Thanks
So
so much. Yeah.
perfect. So any final thoughts or comments, Wes?
Yeah. Just you know, like I recently released a video just talking about Star Wars Acolyte and some of the problems with that. And for me, it's just like a lot of people focus on the culture war aspects of Star Wars Acolyte, like red pill versus blue pill. And like
Hmm.
I know it's kind of funny, lesbian space witches. It's like how But for me, the more interesting question wasn't so much about lesbian space witches, although I'll never get tired of using that phrase, but of the writing, the quality of the writing, and just from a put aside culture war, red pill, blue pill stuff to the side, and just look at it
Right.
as like a writing practice. Um,
Right.
and it's really not written well. It's really not. Like I'm shocked. Like I am, in episode number 4, it's most of it is just the characters walking through a forest, and to so that they can kill a Wookiee Jedi. And near the end, like they try to do a twist, a reveal to show that a person who we thought was kind of goofy and harmless turned out to be very harmful. And that the way they
Mm-hmm.
twisted that, you could literally see the thumb of the writer on the plot. Like, why are you doing so? It just, I'm rambling. But essentially, long story short, like, you know, you guys who are listening to this, audience members, thankfully you have a lot of options. There's a lot of crap out there, but you have a
Right.
lot of options. And so you have no obligation to be loyal to crap. And so
Yeah.
if you are going to spend money or time and attention on a series, like, our lifespans are short, do it on something that you feel like is really high quality, because they're supposed to be serving you, not you them. And
Right.
listen, even my series, if it's not your cup of tea, if you think like, Wes, what is this? I I I lost 5 IQ points by reading your story. Like, fine. I mean, you do you, boo. But I just
Yeah.
really want to exhort people to be like more. Don't feel pressured. If there's something that you don't like, it's not your fault that you don't like it, and don't let people
Right.
shame you by calling you names like bigot, or you're a hater, or it's your fault. Because literally, there are Hollywood screenwriters right now. Like one person, he literally, because Furiosa, I think it was Furiosa. No,
Yeah.
I think it was something about one of the recent movies, maybe one of the Planet of the Apes movies. He said that the reason that movie failed is because audience members suck. He used more vulgar language, but
Yeah.
just, I don't want to get you in trouble. So he is essentially blamed the audience. I'm like, how can you blame the audience? You can't blame. Like, if you have a restaurant, and people are eating your duck soup, and they just start
Yeah.
vomiting, you can't blame them. There's E. coli in your soup, dude. Like, fix it.
Yeah.
So that's my thing. It's just like, don't let people shame you. If there's a piece of fiction, of entertainment that you just don't find entertaining, then
Right.
go find something else. There's no reason for you to have to be loyal to mediocrity.
Well, thank you so much, Wes. And listen, come back on when you got a couple more issues out. We'll talk more about it.
100%. Thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome. I'm gonna timestamp this, Wes. Do you hear my kids in the background? Do you hear them?
No, I don't. I don't.
Oh, okay. I can't make it. Hey, Daddy's doing a podcast. Hey, Jordan. Hey, Jordan. Hey, Daddy's doing a podcast. You need to be quiet. There we go.
So I have 2 of my own. I have a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old, and